Thank you very much. Uachtaráin stúthór chuiniúisle fáilte roimh go léir. Tá lán áthas ar an bheith anseo inniu chun an códáil tábhachtach sin oscailt. For those of you who've travelled from overseas, you don't need to grab your headphones or wait for the interpreter. That's just a little bit of Irish, and it's nice to use it, I think, from time to time, and particularly for guests from overseas to hear what it sounds like. Madam President, distinguished guests, delegates, it's a real pleasure to be here today to represent the Irish Government and to open this important conference. I think for all of us, what we want sport to be is about high performance, about excellence, about competition, about participation, and also particularly about health, because sport can contribute so much to healthier and active lifestyles, both physically and psychologically. But what we definitely want to make sure that sport is not about is about people getting injured and damaged as a consequence of their involvement in sport. And I think that's why this conference is particularly important. It's an area that I've a personal interest in, both as Minister with responsibility for sport, but also as a medical doctor who practiced for a number of years as a GP, had patients with acquired brain injury, and someone who did, I think it was three A&E jobs and saw a lot of injuries of different types from sport, from rugby, from equestrian, and also from other areas too. It's also an area that is relevant to part of my other brief, which is transport, because a huge number of people acquire brain injuries as a result of road traffic collisions. And one thing we've done in our road safety strategy is to change that strategy, so the focus just isn't on reducing the number of deaths every year, but also to reduce the number of serious injuries, so that fewer people have to deal with the consequences of crashed lives and long-term injuries as a result of road traffic collisions. But before I talk about the substantive issue for the day, I just want to finally touch on my other brief, which is tourism, and to particularly welcome those of you who've come from overseas. You're very welcome to Dublin. I hope you enjoyed the conference, and I do hope you get a chance to see the city and also perhaps see a little bit of the countryside as well. I'm not going to speak for very long. I know you're going to want to hear from the medical professionals, from the athletes, and from the people who have acquired brain injury but are living with it and adapting to it. So there are really just three things I'm going to touch on very briefly. One, a little bit about Ireland, given the significance of today. A little bit about sport and sports policy and where we are in that space, and putting this into context. And then thirdly, a little bit about brain injury and how it interacts with sport, and how the government wants to assist certainly sporting bodies and ABI with their work. As you know, particularly for those of you who've come from overseas, you're in Ireland on what is a very significant weekend. Back in 2008 or 2009, our economy crashed, and in 2011 we entered a bailout and were the first European country to do so, followed by Greece, Portugal and Cyprus. This Sunday we'll be the first country in the European Union to exit that bailout, which makes this a period of time very significant. Certainly everything is not rosy in the garden. Unemployment is still very high. A lot of families are struggling to make ends meet, particularly dealing with the burden of debt. And also a lot of businesses are struggling too. But I do think for the first time in a very long time, things are very definitely going in the right direction. Unemployment is falling. The national debt has now started to fall as well, and we're seeing a rise in investment and also exports. So it's been a very tough couple of years in this country. The government has had to make some very hard decisions, but really it's due to the sacrifices of the Irish people and their resilience that we have got to the point that we are now. So really, for me, in many ways, this is kind of the halfway point of our government's term in office. The first half was about restoring our reputation, about bringing about financial and political stability, and this weekend restoring our sovereignty to the extent that that means anything in modern times. The next 2 years are going to be different. It's going to be about securing the gains that we've made. It's going to be about rebuilding our prosperity, and it's also going to be about making sure that everyone gains in that, and everyone gains from the upturn, and that we have a more equal recovery than we had before. Sport is a very important part of government policy, as you know. The last couple of years probably hasn't been the easiest time to be Minister for Sport, particularly because we've been dealing with shrinking budgets. But we have seen a lot of very good things as well. We've seen some really phenomenal performances by our teams and athletes in recent years, helping to lift the spirits of the nation at a very difficult time. And we've also seen consistently year on year an increase in the number of people participating in sport, particularly individual sports, and that's extremely encouraging. And that's really why government does support sport. It's not just about the medals and the trophies, even though they're important. It's really about participation and getting people involved in active lifestyles. There's really been four things that Michael Ring and I have tried to do in this brief. The first is to protect funding for sport, which has been exceedingly difficult. But 2014 will be the first year since 2008 that the budget for sport will actually increase. It'll increase from about 74 million to 90 million. And that's the whole sport budget. It's the Sports Council, the Sports Campus, the grants for facilities and equipment, and also the swimming pools programme. And that'll increase next year for the first time. The biggest element of that is, of course, the Sports Council. And they'll see a decrease of about 2% next year, most of which will be delivered from savings related to the Haddington Road Agreement, particularly if they're implemented all the way down the line. So what that does mean is that funding for sport is higher than it was at 2006 levels, which was during the boom period in Ireland. And if you compare it with the arts, and people often compare sport with the arts and perhaps compare it unfairly with the arts, but the arts budget is down 30% on 2006. So I think in very difficult times we've done the best that we can to protect budgets. The second priority was the National Sports Campus, and that's developing really well. If people get a chance to visit that, they should. The National Aquatic Centre is there a long time. FAI HQ, the Institute of Sport is there too. But what's new is Sports HQ. The pitches that are there on site now, the pavilion, the equestrian pentathlon training centre, there's a lot of facilities there, and there's going to be a lot more in the year ahead, particularly when we get started on the indoor arena. The third thing was to recognise sport properly in education. I've always felt that sport, or physical education rather, should be recognised in the same way as music or art is, for example, a subject that has a practical element but also an academic element to it too. And that will start next year when sport becomes, or physical education as a part of education, prefers to call it, becomes a core subject in the new junior cycle. And we'd intend to make it a core subject as well, or an optional subject for Leaving Cert as well, so that people can do it for their Leaving Cert. That doesn't mean people are going to get points for playing football, but what it does mean is that there'll be a set of portfolio work which is around either performance or coaching, and then also an academic aspect to the subject around the science of sport, the business of sport, physiology, anatomy, and everything else. And the fourth thing was to restore what used to be called the old National Lottery grants, the grants for sporting facilities. And we've done one round of that, and we'll do another round of that next year. So as I said earlier, the government really supports sport, not just because we want to make sure that Irish athletes can fulfil their potential, and not just because we want to see Irish teams do well and deliver national pride. It's really because we want people to participate in sport, and that's the real focus of government policy. But sometimes sport isn't good for your health. In fact, sometimes sport can damage your health, and that can show itself in a number of ways. It can show itself from doping, for example, where athletes feel under pressure to take drugs and do things that they shouldn't be doing. And also it can happen when people get injuries as a result of sport, and that includes all sorts of injuries, brain injuries being just one of those. And I think that's why this conference is so important, because we want to make sure that brain injuries are prevented, and that where they do occur, that they're managed and managed well, and people are assisted with rehabilitation. When I actually think about head injuries and concussion, the person that springs to mind for me is Benjamin Robinson. He's not somebody I've ever met. He's a 14-year-old kid in Northern Ireland who died as a result of second impact syndrome during a school rugby match. But I remember that particularly because it happened a couple of weeks after I took up office, and it kind of made me really think about that. And it's something that should not have happened, and it could have been avoided. And it's not that anyone is to blame, but through awareness, through education, and through a number of other things, we can actually prevent brain injury. I think it's really essential that all coaches, that players and officials at every level are aware of the symptoms of concussion, that they're aware of the guidelines and the procedures in place, and that we all adopt a culture of protecting athletes and heroes. We all want to see our sporting heroes performing feats of magnificence and doing things that we can talk about for years and say we were at the match when X or Y happened. But we don't want heroes to put their lives on the line. and we don't want athletes and players to risk their own long-term health, really just for short-term success. As Minister, I want to say that I'm really supportive of all the actions that are being taken by groups like Acquired Brain Injury Ireland, by the different sporting organisations, also individual advocates and professionals that work on this issue. As you know, the Irish sporting bodies have been very active in this space already. Just on Monday, the IRFU launched their new guide to concussion, and the guide calls on all players to be honest with themselves and medical staff in reporting symptoms, and outlines the need for comprehensive medical assessment. The guide contains a pocket concussion recognition tool that lists the signs and symptoms of concussion for players, coaches, officials and parents, and team managers and medical staff. The GAA has partnered with ABI in the past, has done some very good work on awareness, particularly their awareness posters, and they're currently delivering a new awareness campaign. And one thing they did do a couple of years ago, which I think was very important, was to make the wearing of helmets mandatory in hurling. And that was a little bit controversial at the time, if I remember it. And yet nobody, I think, would ever consider going back on that now, or at least I hope not. And similarly, the FAI has done a lot in the space too. They published SCAT3 recently, which is a standardised tool for evaluating injured athletes and concussion. And I think that was very important too. As sports fans, we all enjoy watching and supporting our sports people playing at their best and giving everything for their team. But we also must support them in doing what's the right thing for them in terms of safety and their long-term health if there's any indication of concussion. We all have a duty to behave responsibly when it comes to head injury and concussion, and sensible and safe behaviour can only benefit our games and the players and fans in the long term. So in conclusion, I want to thank ABI for hosting this event. I'd like to commend them and applaud them on the work they do in providing rehabilitation and support to people with neuro-rehabilitative needs, and also enable them to lead more meaningful lives in the community. So finally, with no further ceremony, I'd like to officially declare the conference open. Thank you very much.